My name is 𝘎𝘮𝘯𝘏, a professor at 𝘎𝘮𝘯 University in Cleveland, Georgia, and I want to talk about the problem of evil. This is a very famous challenge to Christianity, actually. It's arguably the single most significant challenge to Christianity from the field of philosophy. Basically, the problem is that Christianity believes in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. But given that that is true, the problem of evil is, why does evil exist? Because if there really is a God who is all-powerful, then that God could certainly get rid of evil if he so desired. And if he's all-knowing, he knows that evil exists, and he knows how it's going to proliferate and increase. And so combining those two, he's both all-powerful, all-knowing, he certainly would know that it's out there, know that it's going to get worse, and be able to do something about it. Lastly, he's an all-good God. If that's true, then why in the world would he let evil exist? And so the challenge here is, given that Christianity believes in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, why does evil exist? There's even some sub-questions. Given that that is true of God, how did evil even arise in the first place? Why did he let it arise in the first place? And why does he let it continue once it's in place? There's another set of questions that have to do with a distinction between two different types of evil. There is moral evil, which is probably what most people think of when they think of evil. They think of something, a moral agent, an agent that can make a decision as to between good and evil and choose evil. Intentional choice of, purposeful choice of evil as opposed to good. But there's another classification of evil called natural evil. The idea here is this isn't anything or anybody that's making a decision for evil, but evil actually exists out there in the natural world. It's in the form of animal and human suffering. For example, you've got a child, innocent child, isn't guilty, presumably, of anything that is worthy of the horror that the child is going through in some horrible disease that's causing great pain, great suffering for the person. Or looking at some organisms, some animals out in the world, they can suffer. Why do animals have to suffer? That is a natural evil. A flood comes along and there's animals and humans that suffer as a result. The flood, which isn't presumably some organism making, or some entity making a decision, oh, I want to be bad, I want to do evil, but whatever it does, it causes suffering in humans and animals or animals. Volcanic explosions, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, lightning storms, tornadoes, diseases. These are natural phenomena that result in suffering of animals and humans. And presumably, again, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God is not going to permit that kind of suffering. So the problem doesn't just apply to why is there evil, intentional evil, moral evil in the world, but why is there natural evil in the world? And another issue that is part of this whole thing is there is a question about why does evil in general exist, but there's also the much more difficult issue of why did evil occur on this particular individual? Why did this child go through this kind of suffering? Why did this particular family have to go through this kind of suffering? given that it's an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. This is a God who knows the individual suffering. So why is he permitting the particular evil that this person is going through? We have examples in Scripture. Job, horrible things that happened to Job. Job said, why is this stuff happening to me? Some terrible things happened to him. And the whole book, in a sense, addresses or is somehow responding to this question. His friends come to him and say, this evil that's come upon you must be because you've done something bad. And Job says, I haven't done that. And we know from, because we're given more information, that no, Job is not responsible for it. There's true evil, natural evil, and some forms of moral evil that are experienced by Job. And the question is, why? Why is this man blind? Why is this man suffering from this disease? All of those are questions that are in this larger category of the problem of evil. And again, that problem of evil is the single most difficult philosophical problem for Christianity, and has been from the beginning of Christianity. If there's anybody that creates some sort of a response, an answer, an explanation of how the problem of evil is to be resolved, it is called a theodicy. A theodicy is a Christian response to or defense of the problem of evil as the accusation is made upon Christianity. Now, there's a problem here. Even though Christianity has been around for thousands of years, there's been many, many, many thousands of people who have considered this problem of evil, and some very, very clever people through time. There is nonetheless no single accepted theodicy to address at least all of these questions that the problem of evil poses to Christianity. In part, the reason is because there are so many very difficult questions here. The issue is complicated. That's part of the reason that a single theodicy is not available. But it's also in part because Scripture doesn't actually give us the answer. And so we have to devise our own understanding or answer to this problem. And of course, a third contribution to this is that there is no single accepted understanding of God, theology. And so it's perhaps not surprising that there is then no single accepted theodicy. If we look through the history of the church at various theodicies, the theodicy that is accepted by most people, the most popular, we'll put it that way, the most popular theodicy in the history of the church is Augustine's free will defense. And it's not addressing all of the questions that the problem of evil addressed. At least Augustine wasn't trying to address all of them. He was focused mainly on these upper questions. And it's really thus addressing the question of moral evil, the origin, nature, and proliferation of moral evil, intentional evil in the world. And let's, for a moment, look at Augustine's free will defense. His first claim, which is intriguing, is that he defines evil as something that's not a thing. He came from a tradition, Augustine did, before he became a believer, where the theology, the theological belief that he came from was that evil was a thing, that evil and good were two different things that coexisted for eternity past. And he comes out of that thinking and enters Christianity as a tremendously powerful thinker, a very brilliant man who sort of redefines the whole question, says, wait a minute, the issue is that evil is not really a thing. It's not an entity that exists and coexists with good, and that they've been in battle with each other, the popular view that he believed and most people believed. Instead, Augustine says that moral evil, again, that's his focus. He's looking at the issue of moral evil. Moral evil is where a person, an entity that is capable of creating moral evil, is choosing a lesser evil. I'm sorry, lesser good. He's choosing a lesser good. So you've got choices on what you can do, and there's a high choice, if you wish, that involves all good. And then there's another choice that it's a good thing, but it's not as good as the higher one. And so the idea is any choice which chooses a lesser good, it's choosing a good, good is real, but evil is not. Evil is merely a measure of the lesser good that an individual or entity chooses. And second of all, Augustine's free will defense argued that angels and humans were created with a free will. They are free to make a decision. They could choose the highest good or any of these other goods, and they are fully free to do so. And that free will beings, case of angels and humans, some of the angels and humans, chose the lesser good. And as a result, that was the entry of evil. So how did evil come to be in the first place? It isn't something created by God, so he's not responsible directly for the creation of evil. He is he's creating beings that can choose good, and those beings choose to choose the lesser good. And that is the origin of evil. And also part of Augustine's argument is God saw that there was more good, being able to see into the future, God saw more good in a creation with the choice of lesser goods than a creation with beings that don't have a free will. If he created a bunch of beings that couldn't make a choice, putting it another way, they always choose what's right, he sort of created automatons. That's not really very good in a sense. It's not as good, so the argument goes, as creating a being that has the ability to choose the lesser good, but chooses to the greater good. And the few instances, or at least the instances of those better good choices, are so much better than creating automatons that God created a creation with free will beings so that they would in some cases anyway, choose the best good. So Augustine, and again, that particular, I'm trying to summarize a complicated argument in a few words, but that particular free will theodicy has been, again, probably the most popular theodicy to the problem of evil down through the centuries. Now, Augustine, though, did not develop a complete theodicy for all the questions. He did not, in particular, develop a theodicy in regards to natural evil. That wasn't the focus of what he was addressing. At the same time, he did make some statements which allude to a potential explanation of at least some natural evil. He did, in fact, make the claim that some natural evil, acknowledged some natural evil, and he said some of it was due to man's fall. In other words, the moral evil that entered the world led somehow to an explanation of the origin of at least some natural evil. So again, focusing on the natural evil issue, which is the point of the rest of the talk, natural evil are events that cause suffering in animals or humans. Let's look at those for a moment, and we'll come back to Augustine's explanation to see how adequate his Theodicy is in addressing them. We can classify natural evil into at least two different categories. Geological natural evils. These are things that are characteristics of the earth, events on the earth, the earth's atmosphere, that sort of thing that again cause suffering in animals or humans. Earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, floods, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes. These are not organisms. These are events in earth history that result in animal or human, or could result in animal or human suffering. Then there are biological what I call biological natural evils. These are where, like diseases, that are caused by organisms or caused by deficiencies in organisms. Pathological organisms that cause disease, parasites that cause, again, suffering in animals and humans. Degenerative aging, when you get old and decrepit and increased suffering as you age, would be an example of a biological natural evil. It results in suffering of animals and humans. Death itself, maybe a quick death, quick painless death doesn't result in suffering, but other forms of death do involve considerable suffering. Predation, one organism eating another, one animal eating another animal. Again, if that's quickly done, it might not involve any suffering, but predation obviously is something that can lead to animal or human suffering. The process of natural selection, of organisms struggling for survival, struggling for limited resources and starving to death or because of it, and this sort of thing can lead to suffering in animals or humans. So Augustine's Theodicy, which has to do with moral agents, free will agents making choices, doesn't directly apply to these. And so we're going to take Augustine's Theodicy and modify it because it seems to be good for at least the moral moral side of things. Let us see if we can modify Augustine's Theodicy to address the question of natural evil. If we assume that Scripture's claim at the end of Genesis chapter 1, it says he looked at everything he had created and made, and behold, it was very good, that in fact that very good creation did not have any evil. It didn't have any moral evil by Augustine's Theodicy because humans had not yet made that decision, and presumably also we can argue that angels had not yet made that moral decision to choose a lesser good, so that there was no moral evil in the world. But let's further argue that the very good creation was a time when there was no geological natural evil or no biological natural evil. None of these things are a part of the original creation by God. So no geological natural evils means there's no earthquakes, no volcanoes, no tsunamis, no floods, no droughts, no wildfires, hurricanes, or tornadoes. No biological natural evils means at the original creation, there's no genetic diseases, there's no degenerative aging. So if you get hurt, which you're probably going to get hurt, the repair processes did not involve suffering. They were quick and, we'll argue, perfect repair. Get you back to where you're not suffering at all. No pathological organisms, no organisms that cause disease, no organisms that are parasites. There is, in fact, relationships between organisms that are entirely mutualistic. They're entirely favor. Each organism is helping the other organism. They're each benefiting each other. A period when there's no predation. Animals and man are both vegetarians. They're not hurting other animals. There is no chance that predation would lead to suffering. There's also no defenses, by the way. There would be no no reason for camouflage. There would be no reason for animals to have, protective behaviors or protective coverings, like a shell or something to prevent predation, or spines or something like that. There's also no natural selection. There's completely adequate resources. The number of organisms that are born is equal to the food resources which are available. There's no struggle for survival. There's no overpopulation. The rate of reproduction is appropriate for the resources. There's no death of animals or humans. The plants are producing just exactly enough of what they need for their own persistence and as food for animals. So in this, so the beginning of our story here, the answer to natural evil problem is that the original creation didn't have any of it. Then I would suggest what happened is when humans made the moral decision to choose a lesser good, when the king of creation, because God created humans to rule over his creation, when the king fell, the entire creation was then cursed. That God himself cursed the creation. The heavens then, the entire universe, from the heavens all the way to the smallest particles, begin a process of decay. They're no longer able, as they would have been before this, to persist forever. The universe, the earth, the sun, all entities in the universe will wax old. And as a result, there's a potential here for suffering to enter as a result. The universe is going to go towards a heat death. The sun is running down, running out of fuel. Planetary orbits are decaying, and this has been happening ever since that curse event. The earth begins to wax old, the earth itself, resulting in earthquakes and volcanoes and floods, the tsunamis, catastrophic weather, droughts, and wildfires. These are all the result of a decaying or dying earth that comes with the curse. There is then not the previously perfect biological repair processes, but imperfect repair processes, resulting in mutations, mistakes in the DNA that are not repaired, but persist through time. It results in degenerative aging, pathological organisms that are no longer helping the organisms around them, but actually inflicting pain and suffering in organisms. Parasites, organisms that are now going to be taking more from another organism than they are giving, as they did before the curse. Plants no longer producing enough to supply not just their own needs, but also all the resources that are needed by animals. And as a result, animals are enter that struggle for survival, and natural selection introduces suffering. At the same time, I'm going to argue that same God who cursed the creation, resulting in the natural evils, put limits on that natural evil so that it wouldn't spread, wouldn't, let's say, exponentially increase to result in the destruction of humanity and the destruction of organisms, which is easy to see how a perfect world that becomes imperfect might well just lead it right into destruction. But God actually institutes with the curse, he puts things into the creation, put limits on that suffering, puts limits on that decay processes. So he actually introduces the phenomenon of death, so that if death hadn't been introduced at this point, if what you have is just decay, that every day of your life you hurt a little bit more than you hurt the day before, that you become more and more decrepit for hundreds, thousands millions of years, that's torture. that's where pain becomes suffering, becomes extreme suffering. So God introduces death to put an end to and maximize the amount of suffering, saying, hey, there's no more after this amount. You die, animals and humans now die, which terminates the suffering, thus limiting it. Also, he introduces processes like overproduction. Since before the curse was instituted, organisms, plants produced everything necessary, exactly what was necessary for the demands of the animals. What happens here is that now with the curse, it's now producing less than what's needed, and organisms are now going to die. The populations that needed to, let's say, be 1,000 in order to persist are going to be dying, so you're going to have to produce more offspring than will survive in order to keep the population at a constant level. But as soon as you're doing that, you're introducing more organisms into the environment than the environment can sustain. So we call that overproduction. So the overproduction is a good thing to keep the population steady, but it introduces a struggle for survival. It introduces the concept of natural selection, where organisms are competing against other organisms for limited resources, which effectively increases the health of the population, because then there's some organisms are going to die in that process, but which organisms are? It's probably going to be the organisms that are weakest, the organisms that are hurting the most, the organisms that are in fact suffering the most. So they're preferentially taken out of the population, which then means that this natural selection process, even though it would be a terrible thing in the world before the curse, it's a wonderful thing after the curse, because it limits the amount of suffering that organisms have to go through. Organisms that begin to suffer because of disease or whatever the case are no longer able to compete with the organisms that are stronger, and they will die early, thus limiting their suffering. God introduces predation, where animals are eating now other animals. And of course, this would be a bad thing before the curse, but after the curse, if one animal is pursuing another to eat that animal, pursuing a population of them, they're only going to be able to catch the ones that are weakest, that are slowest, and so on. Again, it's going to preferentially take out the weaker organisms, the ones that are suffering. We've even done experiments with this, where we've taken out predators and watched populations to see what would happen. And actually the prey population becomes more full of disease, and it becomes a less healthy population. And in fact, if you take away natural selection, you take away predation, there is greater suffering that results. So these are things that are introduced by God at the time of the curse to limit suffering so that it doesn't go past a particular point that is prescribed by the Creator. And so now the theodicy that we now have, that I've now introduced, is what I call Augustine's free will defense modified. And once you include this concept of an initially idyllic creation, one without natural evil, and then a creation that is cursed at the fall of man, I think it provides an answer to the general problem of not just moral evil, but natural evil. Augustine's free will defense portion of it seems to address satisfactorily the origin of moral evil, and the modification of it addresses the origin of natural evil. At least it explains suffering in general. Now, the more specific questions of why this person ends up in pain and as opposed to another, that's an issue that this particular theory does not address, but at least the general problem of evil, I think it does address, and that it seems to me to be the only theodicy to do that. It's the only theodicy available that addresses this much of the problem of evil challenge to Christianity. And as a paleontologist, I can make this worse. And it's the problem of what I call paleo-evil. So we see the biological and geological evil of the present. When we look at the fossil record, we have a record of life, but we also have a record of natural evil, biological and geological natural evil. And some of it is directly evidenced in the fossil record. We have over 120 impact craters that we think are due to bolides coming in from outer space. We haven't even considered those in our list of geological evils because we haven't seen one of these things in the recent past. This almost certainly would have resulted in, or should have resulted in, animal and human suffering. So this is an additional geological evil that we haven't even considered yet. We also have supervolcanoes, not just volcanoes, but huge volcanoes, huge provinces of lava that indicate enormous eruptions in the past, thousands of times bigger than the eruptions that we see in the present. So this is a geological evil at a much higher level than we see in the present. Superquakes producing enormous deformations in rocks, many times, thousands. There's not even a way to measure it right now, how much bigger these things are than earthquakes we've experienced in the last 4,000 years. These are really much bigger geological evils than we see in the present. We have also biological evil. We have billions of fossils, billions of carcasses, and about 250,000 species in the record that aren't in the present world. 250,000 species that have gone away. They existed in the past and they're now gone. Something destroyed them. Something took them out. And I would suggest that those are natural evils. There's evidence, direct evidence of predation, disease, and injury in the fossil record. We see the organisms that take bites out of other organisms, teeth embedded in other organisms that the predator was trying to eat. So we have direct evidence of a lot of paleo-evil that we don't have evidence for in the present. And it is made far, far worse if we assume that what we're seeing is just a small part of the evil that was actually there. The fossil record is only preserving a small part of what actually existed in the past. And so what we see, we can assume that there's more that we haven't got evidence for. But now if you add one other thing, if in fact these rocks are representing not, as I as a young age creationist would suggest, are only a year or a few thousand years of history, if these rocks are recording evidence of millions or hundreds of millions of years of Earth history, then what you see directly evidenced in the rocks, you have to multiply by millions in order to reasonably expand that to how much natural evil there really was. So if we only see 120 impact craters, you can assume that if the Earth is old and we've only got 1/1000th of the geological evidence of what happened in the past, then we're talking about tens of thousands of impacts that have occurred in Earth history. If we're seeing this many supervolcanoes and superquakes and carcasses as we see right now in the record, if the earth is very old, we have to multiply that by millions. We're talking about billions of organisms that have died in time. That we're not just talking about predation and disease on thousands and thousands of specimens, but it has to be on billions of specimens in Earth history. The natural evil that would have to have occurred on this planet if the Earth is very old is many orders of magnitude greater than the natural evil if the Earth is only thousands of years old. So what we have here is we have, I would contend that we have an answer to the problem of paleo-evil. Not just an answer to the problem of evil, which people are focused on the present, but more importantly for me as a paleontologist, we've also got an answer for the problem of paleo-evil. But only if the Earth is in fact young. This only becomes an answer, Augustine's free will defense modified, only becomes an answer for paleo-evil if in fact all of the evidence of paleo-evil in all the rocks of the earth are after man's sin and man's fall, only after the curse. So only if you start with an earth only thousands of years old that has no evil, either moral or natural, that then falls into or is subject to natural evil following man's fall, it's only when you have that kind of situation, a young earth with that has no evil at the beginning and it's introduced at the fall of man, that explains paleo-evil. Otherwise, if you happen to believe that the earth is old, then no matter how you play the game, you're going to end up with a bunch, most orders of magnitude more paleo-evil than you're explaining in the present following the curse in Augustine's free will defense. No matter how you do it, you're going to have orders of magnitude more paleo-evil than we're trying to explain with the problem of evil that you can't explain. It's all got to be, if the earth is old, it's going to be before man's origin. It's going to be before the fall of angels. It's not going to be due to man's fall or angelic fall. It's got to be the way the earth was originally created. God himself must have set up the earth. There's no one else around, right? I mean, there's no one there but God, the creator. He must have set up the earth in such a way that for hundreds of millions of years before he even brought humans into being, he has his animals suffering, his animals undergoing unbelievable degrees of suffering. Millions of organisms, thousands of species, millions of species coming into existence, going out of existence under torturous conditions for hundreds of millions of years before he finally creates man. And if the earth is old, we've got these orders of magnitude more natural evil than Augustine's free will Theodicy was even intended to explain. You're left with God having created intentionally this earth with natural evil, and not only creating it with it, so he's responsible. He's the one that created the evil, the natural evil. And he let it persist for 500 million years before he even created humans. He's causing animals to suffer for 500 million years. Animals are not responsible for this. They're innocent. This is, I don't know, I don't know how to say it, but this is horrible. This is an evil God. This is a God who perpetrates torture on innocent animals for 500 million years. That's just not possible. That's not an answer. It cannot be true. This earth is not old. God is not evil. He did not create the world that way. The evil that we see in the world is a consequence of man's choice to choose a lesser good. And God's response to that with controlled evil, controlled natural evil, to in fact encourage man to come back to him. That explains, Augustine's free will defense, modified, explains all the natural evil and moral evil that we're aware of and that we infer. And it's an adequate answer to the question of the origin of evil, the problem of evil. But if the earth is old, you're left with no choice but to believe that our God is an evil, cruel, mean, tortuous God, and that is not the God of Scripture.